The sun beat down mercilessly on the makeshift prisoner of war camp in Okinawa, June 1945. The air was thick with tension, humidity, and the lingering smell of war. Among the rows of tents and barbed wire fences, a moment was about to unfold that would challenge everything the soldiers thought they knew about duty, compassion, and the thin line between protocol and humanity. Sergeant James Crawford had seen more than his share of horrors during his 3 years in the Pacific Theater. At 27, his face carried lines that belonged to a much older man. The campaigns through Guadalcanal, Saipan, and finally Okinawa had hardened him. But somewhere beneath the layers of military training and survival instinct, the farm boy from Iowa still existed. He remembered his mother's words before he shipped out. Never lose your humanity, no matter what you see. The war in the Pacific had been brutal beyond imagination. By June 1945, the Battle of Okinawa had just concluded, leaving over 100,000 Japanese military casualties and forcing thousands of civilians and military personnel into American custody. The prisoner of war camps were hastily constructed, overcrowded, and stretched the resources of the occupying forces to their absolute limits. Medical supplies were scarce, interpreters were few, and cultural misunderstandings were constant. Crawford walked his daily patrol through the civilian detention area, where Japanese nationals who had been caught in the crossfire of war waited for processing. Among them were nurses, teachers, shopkeepers, and farmers, people who had never wanted this war but found themselves consumed by it anyway. The International Red Cross had established guidelines for the treatment of prisoners, but in the chaos of the Pacific Campaign, those rules were often bent or broken by the sheer impossibility of the situation. Yuki Yamamoto sat in the shade of a tent, her dark eyes fixed on the ground. At 24, she had served as a civilian nurse in a field hospital until American forces overran their position 3 weeks earlier. Her medical training had been thorough, her dedication to helping the wounded absolute regardless of which uniform they wore. But now, dressed in a torn and dirty traditional dress, she was just another nameless prisoner in a sea of defeated faces. She felt the pain growing in her abdomen, sharp and insistent. It had started 2 days ago as a dull ache, but now it felt like something was tearing inside her. Yuki recognized the symptoms from her medical training: appendicitis. Without treatment, it would progress to peritonitis, sepsis, and death. She had seen it happen to soldiers on both sides of the conflict. But how could she communicate this to her captors? The guards didn't speak Japanese, and she knew only a handful of English words. Private Danny Martinez, fresh-faced and barely 21, had been assigned to the camp just 4 days earlier. This was his first real deployment, having spent most of the war in training stateside. He carried a small notebook where he documented everything he saw, convinced that future generations would need to understand what really happened in these camps. His camera, a prized possession sent by his family, hung around his neck. He had promised his mother he would record the truth, whatever that turned out to be. Lieutenant Samuel Parker had been a doctor in civilian life, practicing in a quiet Boston suburb before Pearl Harbor changed everything. At 35, he had volunteered immediately, believing his medical skills could save lives on the battlefield. 3 years later, he ran the medical operations for the entire detention facility, constantly triaging who would receive treatment and who would have to wait. The ethical compromises wore on him daily, but he had learned to compartmentalize, to focus on saving as many as possible, rather than dwelling on those he couldn't help. Captain William Thompson commanded the camp with an iron fist, but it was a fist guided by regulation and protocol. At 42, he was too old for frontline combat, but too experienced to waste. His interpretation of the Geneva Convention was strict and literal. Prisoners received adequate food, water, and shelter according to the minimum standards. Nothing more, nothing less. He had seen too many good American boys die to waste sympathy on the enemy, even if that enemy now sat unarmed behind barbed wire. Dr. Helen Morrison represented a different kind of soldier, a Navy nurse who had volunteered for the Pacific Theater. She had spent 2 years moving from island to island, treating wounded Marines and soldiers under fire. At 31, she had developed a reputation for fierce competence and unexpected compassion. She had learned basic Japanese from working with interpreters, and had started to see the prisoners not as enemies, but as human beings caught in the machinery of war. It was Dr. Morrison who first noticed something was wrong. During her routine health inspection of the women's section, she observed Yuki doubled over, sweat pouring down her face despite the shade. Morrison knelt beside her, speaking slowly in broken Japanese. Yuki managed to gasp out a single word: appendix. Then she pointed to her lower right abdomen and made a cutting motion. Morrison's blood ran cold. She had seen appendicitis progress to rupture before. If that happened here, in these conditions, without immediate surgery, the young woman would die within days. Morrison ran to find Lieutenant Parker, her boots kicking up dust as she navigated between the tents. She found him in the medical tent, treating a soldier for an infected wound. She quickly explained the situation, watching Parker's expression shift from concern to grim calculation. They had limited surgical supplies, no proper operating theater, and a camp commander who would question every deviation from standard procedure. But they both knew that the Hippocratic Oath didn't recognize nationality or military status. Parker immediately grabbed his medical bag and followed Morrison back to where Yuki lay. He performed a quick examination, pressing gently on her abdomen. When he released the pressure, suddenly Yuki screamed. Rebound tenderness, definitive sign of acute appendicitis. Parker checked his watch. They had maybe 12 to 18 hours before rupture became likely. After that, her chances of survival would drop dramatically. The problem was immediate and obvious. Yuki's traditional Japanese dress was a complex garment, wrapped and tied in ways that Parker and Morrison didn't understand. To examine her properly, to confirm the diagnosis and prepare for emergency surgery, they needed access to her abdomen. But the dress was designed to preserve modesty, with multiple layers and intricate fastenings. Simply asking her to remove it would be culturally traumatic, especially with male soldiers present, and they didn't have time for gentle negotiations through broken language barriers. Parker made the decision. They would need to cut away enough of the dress to perform the examination and surgery if necessary. But he needed someone he trusted, someone who could act quickly and follow orders without hesitation. He sent Morrison to find Sergeant Crawford. Crawford had a reputation as a solid NCO, calm under pressure, and most importantly, someone who could follow difficult orders without letting emotion cloud judgment. Crawford was checking supply inventories when Morrison found him. She quickly explained the situation, Parker's orders, and what would be required. Crawford felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't combat. This was something far more complicated. He would be asked to physically restrain a terrified prisoner and tear her clothing. Even with medical justification, even with witnesses present, it felt wrong. But he had been in the Pacific long enough to know that war constantly forced impossible choices. They returned to where Yuki lay, now barely conscious from the pain. Parker had already briefed Captain Thompson, who had grudgingly approved the emergency medical procedure, but insisted everything be documented and witnessed. Private Martinez was ordered to photograph the process, creating a visual record that would protect everyone involved from later accusations of misconduct. Martinez swallowed hard, but readied his camera. This was the kind of truth he hadn't expected to document. Parker knelt beside Yuki and spoke slowly, using hand gestures to communicate. He pointed to her abdomen, made a cutting motion, and then pointed to the medical tent. Yuki's eyes widened with understanding and fear. She knew what they intended to do, but she also understood why. She had been a nurse. She knew her own symptoms. She gave a small nod, tears streaming down her face. Granting permission in the only way she could, Crawford positioned himself beside her, his hands steady despite the turmoil in his mind. Parker gave the order. Crawford grasped the fabric of Yuki's dress at the lower section and pulled sharply. The sound of tearing cloth seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Other prisoners nearby gasped and some cried out in protest, not understanding what was happening. American soldiers moved to keep order, creating a perimeter around the medical team. The torn fabric revealed Yuki's swollen abdomen. Parker immediately resumed his examination, now able to palpate the area properly. He felt the rigid abdomen, the guarding of the muscles, and the mass in the lower right quadrant. His diagnosis was confirmed. Without surgery in the next few hours, this young woman would die. He looked up at Crawford and nodded. Crawford had done what was necessary. The shocking moment captured in Martinez's photograph would be explained by the medical emergency, not by cruelty or malice. They moved Yuki to the medical tent on a stretcher, Morrison running ahead to prepare the makeshift operating area. Parker scrubbed his hands with precious disinfectant, while Crawford and Martinez helped secure the space. Captain Thompson watched from the entrance, his expression unreadable. This was unprecedented, using limited medical resources on enemy prisoners when American soldiers might need those same supplies. But even Thompson understood that some lines, once crossed, would haunt a man forever. The surgery lasted 3 hours. Parker worked with the concentration of a man defusing a bomb, each cut and suture a battle against infection and time. Morrison assisted with practiced efficiency, anticipating his needs before he voiced them. They had caught it just in time. The appendix was inflamed and beginning to show signs of early rupture, but the infection hadn't spread. They removed it cleanly, irrigated the cavity, and closed the incision with careful stitches. Crawford waited outside the tent with Martinez, neither man speaking. They could hear the clink of instruments, the low murmur of voices, and occasionally Yuki's groans as the limited anesthesia wore thin. Crawford thought about his mother again, about her faith that good men would do good things even in the worst circumstances. He hoped she was right. He hoped this moment would be remembered as an act of mercy, not a violation. When Parker emerged 3 hours later, his surgical gown was soaked with sweat and blood, but his expression carried a grim satisfaction. She would live. With proper post-operative care and assuming no complications, Yuki Yamamoto would recover fully. He looked at Crawford and extended his hand. Crawford shook it, understanding passing between them without words. They had bent the rules, ignored protocol, and risked their careers to save a single enemy prisoner. And they would do it again if necessary. The story might have ended there, buried in camp records and forgotten in the chaos of war's end. But Private Martinez had documented everything with his camera and notebook. The photograph of Crawford tearing Yuki's dress, taken out of context, looked damning. A large American soldier violently ripping the clothing of a helpless Japanese woman. Without explanation, it appeared to be exactly the kind of war crime that military tribunals were being established to prosecute. But Martinez's complete documentation told the real story. The medical emergency, Parker's examination, the diagnosis, the life-saving surgery, the follow-up care over the following weeks as Yuki recovered. Martinez interviewed everyone involved, recording their statements in his careful handwriting. He understood that history would judge this moment, and he wanted the judgment to be based on truth, not assumption. Word of the incident spread through the camp, reaching both prisoners and soldiers. The Japanese prisoners who had initially reacted with horror gradually learned what had actually happened. Yuki, once she recovered enough to speak, explained to her fellow prisoners that the Americans had saved her life, that the soldier who tore her dress had done so not from cruelty but from necessity, that they had treated her with more care than she had any right to expect as a prisoner of war. Dr. Morrison visited Yuki daily during her recovery. Through their limited shared vocabulary and elaborate hand gestures, a friendship formed. Morrison learned about Yuki's medical training, her work in the field hospitals, and her dreams of returning to school after the war. Yuki learned about Morrison's life in America, her reasons for volunteering, and her hope that medicine could bridge the divides that war had created. 3 weeks after the surgery, Yuki was strong enough to walk without assistance. She asked Morrison to arrange a meeting with Sergeant Crawford. Through an interpreter, she wanted to thank him properly. Crawford was reluctant, uncomfortable with being called a hero for doing what anyone would have done, but he agreed to meet her. They sat in the medical tent, the interpreter between them, translating carefully. Yuki spoke at length, explaining her gratitude, her understanding of how difficult his decision must have been, and her belief that he had demonstrated true courage by valuing her life despite the circumstances. Crawford listened, his face reddening with embarrassment. He tried to deflect, to explain that Lieutenant Parker deserved the credit, that he had only followed orders. But Yuki insisted. She understood military hierarchy. She knew that Crawford could have refused, could have questioned the order, could have performed his duty with cruelty instead of care. He had chosen differently. Captain Thompson, witnessing this exchange, felt something shift in his rigid worldview. He had built his career on following regulations, on maintaining clear lines between friend and enemy, us and them. But watching this Japanese nurse thank an American sergeant for saving her life, he recognized the inadequacy of his previous understanding. War created enemies, but it didn't erase humanity. Protocol had its place, but so did mercy. The war in the Pacific ended on August 15, 1945, with Japan's unconditional surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The prisoner of war camps began processing releases, sending Japanese nationals back to their devastated homeland. Yuki was among those released in September, her surgical scar hidden beneath her clothing, but her memory of the Americans who saved her life carried visibly in her changed perspective. Before she left, she gave Morrison a small gift, a carefully folded origami crane made from scrap paper. In Japanese tradition, the crane symbolized hope and healing. Morrison accepted it with tears in her eyes, promising to remember Yuki and to work toward a world where nurses could simply be nurses, caring for the sick, regardless of nationality or politics. Private Martinez compiled his documentation into a complete report, including photographs, interviews, and his own observations. He submitted it to military intelligence, hoping it would contribute to an accurate historical record. The report was filed away, classified along with thousands of other wartime documents, not to be declassified for decades. Crawford returned to Iowa after his discharge in December 1945. He never spoke much about the war, like so many veterans of his generation. The horrors he had witnessed, the friends he had lost, the moral compromises he had made, all of it remained locked away. But sometimes, late at night, he would think about that day in the Okinawa camp, about the sound of tearing fabric and the young woman's life hanging in the balance. In those moments, he allowed himself to believe that he had done something right in a war full of wrong. The years passed. The Cold War replaced the hot one. Japan transformed from defeated enemy to crucial ally. The economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s rebuilt the nation from ruins. Former enemies became trading partners, then friends. But the individual stories, the small moments of humanity that had occurred in the chaos of conflict, remained largely untold. In 1978, a historian researching American occupation policies in post-war Japan came across Martinez's report in the National Archives. The photographs and detailed documentation intrigued her. She tracked down the people involved, finding that most were still alive. Lieutenant Parker, now a respected surgeon in Boston, Dr. Morrison, running a medical mission in Southeast Asia, Captain Thompson, retired and living in Florida, Private Martinez, a journalism professor in California, and Sergeant Crawford, still farming in Iowa. She also tracked down Yuki Yamamoto, now Yuki Tanaka after marriage. Yuki had completed her medical education after the war, becoming a doctor specializing in emergency medicine. She had built a practice in Tokyo and had spent her career advocating for international medical cooperation and understanding. The scar on her abdomen was a permanent reminder of the day when enemy soldiers had chosen to save her life. The historian brought them together for a documentary project, filming interviews with each participant. For the first time in over 3 decades, Crawford and Yuki met again. They were both in their 50s now, their hair graying, their faces lined by time. But the recognition was immediate. Through an interpreter much more skilled than those available in the camp, they finally had a complete conversation. Yuki told Crawford how that moment had shaped her entire career, how she had devoted her life to medicine because she had seen its power to transcend conflict. Crawford, uncomfortable with emotion even after all these years, simply said he was glad she had survived, that she had built a good life. The documentary crew captured it all. The awkward reunion transformed into something profound by the weight of shared history. The documentary, when it aired, challenged simplistic narratives about the Pacific War. It showed American soldiers and Japanese prisoners not as monolithic enemies, but as individuals capable of both terrible violence and unexpected compassion. The image of Crawford tearing Yuki's dress, which could have been used as evidence of American war crimes, instead became a powerful symbol of medical ethics, transcending national boundaries. But the story also raised uncomfortable questions. Why had this incident been so unusual that it warranted documentation and later study? How many other medical emergencies in POW camps had gone untreated because resources were limited or commanders were unwilling to expend effort on enemy prisoners? The Geneva Convention established minimum standards, but the Pacific War had often operated below those minimums, particularly in the chaos of the final campaigns. Historical research revealed that prisoner mortality in Pacific Theater POW camps, while lower than in European camps, was still significant. Disease, inadequate nutrition, and lack of medical care claimed thousands of lives. Yuki's survival was notable precisely because it was exceptional. Parker's willingness to operate, Thompson's grudging approval, Crawford's willingness to follow a difficult order, all of these small decisions had combined to save one life. But for every Yuki who was saved, there were others who weren't so fortunate. The documentary also explored the cultural dimensions of the incident. The tearing of Yuki's dress, while medically necessary, carried symbolic weight in Japanese culture that the American soldiers hadn't fully understood. Traditional clothing represented dignity, propriety, and social status. Its violent removal, even with good intentions, represented a fundamental violation of cultural norms. That Yuki was able to forgive this violation, to recognize the necessity behind it, spoke to her own strength and understanding. Lieutenant Parker, interviewed in his Boston office, reflected on the ethical complexity of wartime medicine. He explained how every decision involved balancing limited resources against unlimited need. How do you justify using precious antibiotics on a prisoner when your own soldiers might need them? How do you allocate surgical time when casualties are arriving hourly? He had lived with these questions for decades, and the documentary forced him to confront them again publicly. Dr. Morrison, speaking from her clinic in Thailand, took a different perspective. She argued that medicine must be universal, or it means nothing. That the moment you start calculating the worth of one patient against another based on nationality, you've betrayed everything the profession stands for. Her decision to identify Yuki's condition and advocate for her treatment had been automatic, instinctive, based on years of training that recognized only sick and healthy, not American and Japanese. Captain Thompson's interview was perhaps the most revealing. Retired and reflective, he admitted that he had been wrong, that his rigid adherence to minimum standards had been a form of moral cowardice, a way to avoid the harder question of what was right versus what was required. He had approved Parker's surgery under protest, documenting his objections in case the decision later came back to haunt his career. But watching Yuki recover, seeing the impact of that single act of compassion, had changed something fundamental in his understanding of leadership. Private Martinez, now Professor Martinez, explained his role as documentarian. He had believed from the beginning that the truth needed to be preserved, even when that truth was complicated or uncomfortable. His photographs and notes had initially been insurance against false accusations, a way to protect Crawford and the others from charges of misconduct. But over time, he had come to see them as something more important, evidence that humanity could persist even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. The documentary concluded with footage of the reunion between all participants, a gathering in San Francisco in 1979. Crawford and Yuki sat at the center with Parker, Morrison, Thompson, and Martinez surrounding them. They shared a meal, exchanged stories, and marveled at how a single moment in a forgotten POW camp had connected their lives across decades and continents. Yuki spoke about her work in emergency medicine, how she had treated American tourists and businessmen in Tokyo, how she had trained young doctors to see patients as people first and nationalities second. Crawford talked about his farm, his children, his quiet life far from the chaos of war, but he also admitted that he thought about Yuki often, wondering if she had survived, hoping that his actions had mattered. The others added their perspectives, creating a chorus of voices reflecting on war, memory, and the small decisions that define character. Parker acknowledged that operating on Yuki had been one of the most important things he had ever done, not because it was surgically complex, but because it had forced him to confront what he truly believed about the value of life. Morrison spoke about how that incident had influenced her decision to dedicate her post-war career to international medical work, trying to heal wounds that went beyond the physical. Thompson, in perhaps the most emotional moment of the gathering, apologized to Yuki directly. He explained that he had viewed her as a file number, a logistical problem, rather than as a human being in crisis. His eventual approval of the surgery had been bureaucratic rather than compassionate. He had learned from that failure, he said, but the lesson had come at the cost of nearly allowing her to die through administrative indifference. The story of the torn dress spread beyond the documentary. It was covered in newspapers and magazines, discussed in classrooms and military ethics courses. It became a case study in medical ethics, in cross-cultural communication, and in the individual choices that collectively define wartime conduct. The dramatic image, properly contextualized, transformed from potential evidence of abuse into a powerful illustration of life-saving intervention. But perhaps the most important impact was personal rather than public. The children and grandchildren of those involved learned about this chapter in their family histories. Crawford's daughter, previously unaware of this incident, gained new understanding of her father's silence about the war. He had carried both horrors and heroism, unable to separate them, choosing silence rather than risk glorifying any part of the conflict. Yuki's children learned that their mother's life had nearly ended before they existed, that their very existence was owed to the split-second decisions of foreign soldiers who could easily have let her die. They grew up with a more nuanced understanding of the war that had devastated their country, recognizing that even in that darkness, there had been flickers of light. The reunion sparked correspondence between the families that continued for years. Christmas cards were exchanged, births and deaths were announced, and gradually the connections deepened. When Crawford died in 1994, Yuki traveled to Iowa for the funeral. She stood in the small country church and spoke about a moment of grace in the middle of war, about an Iowa farm boy who had the courage to make a difficult choice when it would have been easier to look away. When Yuki passed in 2007, Crawford's children attended her funeral in Tokyo. They brought with them the origami crane she had given to Dr. Morrison, which Morrison had bequeathed to the Crawford family before her own death. The crane, faded and fragile, was placed in Yuki's casket, a symbol completing its journey across decades and oceans. The story continues to resonate. Military medical personnel study it as an example of making ethical decisions under impossible time pressure. Cultural historians examine it as a window into the complex human dynamics of the Pacific War, and ordinary people, reading about it or watching the documentary, are reminded that even in war, individual choices matter. That compassion is always possible, even when it seems impossible. In Okinawa, where that POW camp once stood, there is now a memorial park. Among the monuments to battle and sacrifice, there is a small plaque telling the story of Sergeant Crawford and Yuki Yamamoto. It doesn't glorify war or ignore its horrors. Instead, it offers a simple reminder that medical ethics, human decency, and the choice to value life can persist even in the darkest circumstances. The photograph that Private Martinez took that day, the image of Crawford tearing Yuki's dress, is now housed in the National Archives and in the Okinawa Peace Museum. It is always displayed with complete documentation, ensuring that viewers understand the context, the medical emergency, and the life that was saved. The shocking image becomes something different when the reason is known, evidence that in a war defined by dehumanization and mass death, individual acts of humanity still occurred. Lieutenant Samuel Parker's decision to operate on an enemy prisoner, Captain William Thompson's grudging approval despite his reservations, Dr. Helen Morrison's compassionate advocacy, Private Danny Martinez's careful documentation, and Sergeant James Crawford's willingness to follow a difficult order all combined to create a single moment of grace. No one action was sufficient. Each person played their part, and together they saved a life that the machinery of war had marked as expendable. The story asks us to consider what we would do in similar circumstances. When duty and humanity conflict, which do we choose? When resources are scarce and decisions must be made about who receives care, how do we decide? When the enemy is suffering before us, do we see an enemy or a patient? These questions don't have easy answers, but the story of the torn dress suggests that our answers define us more than any military victory or defeat. In the end, the shocking reason that Sergeant Crawford tore the dress of a Japanese woman prisoner of war was the simplest and most profound reason possible: to save her life. No complexity, no ulterior motive, no political calculation, just a medical emergency, limited time, and the choice to act. In a war that claimed millions of lives through deliberate violence, this moment stood apart. Lives being saved through deliberate compassion. The legacy of that moment continues. Yuki's descendants include doctors, nurses, and medical researchers who carry forward her commitment to healing across borders. Crawford's family maintains the farm in Iowa, but they also support medical missions internationally, honoring his memory by extending the compassion he showed on that day in Okinawa. The others, too, have left legacies shaped by that shared experience, ripples spreading outward from a single decision made under impossible pressure. History remembers wars through their battles, their casualties, and their political consequences. But war is also composed of countless individual moments, small decisions that collectively determine whether humanity survives the conflict or becomes another casualty. The story of Sergeant Crawford and Yuki Yamamoto reminds us that even in total war, even when nations become enemies and populations are mobilized for destruction, individual people can still choose compassion over indifference, life over death, and humanity over hate. The torn dress became a symbol not of violation but of healing, not of the divisions between enemies, but of the common humanity that war tries but fails to completely destroy. And the shocking reason, once revealed, transformed from scandal to inspiration, evidence that the best of human nature can persist even in the worst of human circumstances. If this story resonates with you, if it challenges your understanding of war and humanity, if it reminds you that individuals matter even in the midst of mass conflict, please consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you stories from history that are forgotten, overlooked, or misunderstood, stories that reveal the complexity and humanity of the past. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this incredible true story. How would you have acted in Crawford's position? What does this story teach us about medical ethics in wartime? Hit the like button to help others discover this remarkable moment in history, and stay tuned for more untold stories of courage, compassion, and human complexity from World War II and beyond.